Okay, as I said, so welcome to everybody. Great to have you back for what is the second webinar in this 5-webinar series of our Protecting Your Future program. I suppose just for context for those, there are a couple of new joiners this week. So in terms of how this all fits together, this is a 5-webinar program we put together, which is kind of a combination of the two we've been doing through this COVID situation. The first program was around the Survive, Adapt, Thrive thinking, which we then put into a more recent program about how we get productive, start to leverage our brand and sustain growth for the longer term. So we've kind of put this together as a final round of these two programs for you guys. And today it's going to be all around this kind of need to thrive, which is going to be centered around 3 things today. How do we get back to strategy? How do we think about leading change? I think change is always a constant for leaders, but there's definitely going to be a need for some change leadership as we come through this. And we'll just finish off with a couple of things on mindset. So let's get started. I want to talk about getting back to strategy. I think clearly everyone's had to be very tactical. We've had to get into a mindset of survival. But I think the key here is the quicker we can get back to being strategic and get back on plan. We talked a bit last week about, being clear about what our actual mounting is. It probably hasn't changed. The summit's still the same, just need a new path to that summit, and that's going to mean kind of getting back to some strategic thinking. So we're going to run through this next half an hour, as I said, quite punchy as it always is, but I'll try and drop a couple of practical tools in that you can use as we go through these topics. So I think the first thing on strategy, it's one of those topics that comes in and out of fashion and gets overused, but I feel one of the things that would be worth sharing with you is kind of getting some context around strategy, because strategy isn't kind of this one-off thing that we kind of sit down and do once a year and have a bit of an away day. Strategy for me there's an order of things, and we use this model just to kind of demonstrate that really. What at the very top we talk about the need for some strategic direction. So that's kind of where we talk about the big company goals, the visions, the missions, the strategic roadmaps, our purpose in the world. And I think you have to start there so that from that you can then start to talk about how do we then take these big dreams into market. So based on what our market is looking like, what choices do we make, what things do we offer, who do we sell them to, how do we position ourselves against the competition, and how do we exploit those channels. And I think it's only then that you can then start to think about the sales strategy to deliver that go-to-market strategy, and the service and operational strategies that will enable us to serve the clients that choose to work with us. And then you get into the need for a strategy around your people and your finance, compliance, and even innovation, which I'll come back to in a second. But again, there's no point having those strategies if the things above them aren't in place first. So for me, it's very much about an order of things and about understanding the separation of these different types of strategies. We get asked a lot about sales strategy. And actually, I spent the last 2 years, and I've just been talking on a webinar this morning about this, actually looking for some exemplar examples and best practice around sales strategy. And the truth is there's nothing credible written about sales strategy because it doesn't exist in isolation. Whenever you start to look about what you need to do for a sales strategy, you end back up at strategic direction and go to market. And of course, all sales strategy is just the deployment of what the strategic direction and go to market strategy says. So just wanted to give you that so you don't get into that trap of trying to do it all at the same time. You don't produce a 50-page business plan that ends up in a drawer for the next 3 years, and that you start in the right place. And of course, the thing though with strategy is there's a massive assumption that you have a business model underpinning it that's both scalable and sustainable. So that's probably the check and balance with strategy as well. In terms of what strategy is, it can be overly complicated. Sometimes it needs to be quite complicated. It depends on what world you live in. But I think our check with strategy is its very foundation. There should be this simple thinking that ultimately what it says is it clearly defines where we are today, where we're trying to get to, and then works out how we're going to get there. And I think, again, human nature is to solve problems. So we tend very quickly to jump into the how when we get into strategic thinking. But there's definitely a need to slow down to speed up in strategy and actually stop as the leader and say, what is the reality of our current situation? And then when we underpin that against where we want to get to, do we really understand the gap? I've seen many organizations really fall over in not understanding whether their aspiration is too big or actually too small. So I think good to sort of slow down and do that first before you then dive into kind of solving the problems of how you'll make it happen. And it's all about clarity, direction, implementation, as it says there, which will get the outcome. I think just extending that thinking slightly as well, because I know we've got a lot of senior leaders on the webinar today. I think sometimes leaders think they have to do all the strategic thinking and have all the answers. And when you think about what your job really is, your job is to make sure there's real clarity around the organisation around that now, and there's focus on where we want to go, which is really just the intent. And then what people need is they need that intent, and then they need a roadmap to get there. But they don't necessarily need us to tell them how to achieve it. So I think as senior leaders, our job is to get that roadmap in place and then hand it over to our people, empower and enable them to come up with a lot of the answers. And they probably come up with better answers than us because they're closer to the front line with our clients. And then obviously we need to help them manage change, which we'll talk about in a few moments. I think finishing off on this now where how thinking, there's always a need for balance. And I think, again, another pitfall for leaders is they tend to fall to one side of this model. Now, strategy really is the right-hand side there. It's the long-term job of the leaders, owners, directors to find ways to create value. So we're looking for strategies that will enable us to do that. But, we all run businesses day to day. We know there are problems happening right here, right now. So there are short-term issues that need fixing. And that obviously will help us ultimately get to where we want to get to. And I think very simplistically, my conversations with leaders around strategy often is we're too busy to do the strategy. Of course, so they never actually achieve what they want to long term, or they get so obsessed with the idea of creating a great new strategy that they forget to keep an eye on the business right here, right now. So the lesson from this slide here is that the truth is you have to do both, and that's really, really difficult. But as a leader, you do need to help your business tackle those issues of today while standing behind the curtain on the long term and making sure that we're moving towards the longer term aspirations. Okay, so it's always never good when my screen goes completely blank. Okay, let's come back now. Bear with me. Okay, so what I also wanted to share with you is I've been, I think, delivering strategy now for about 10 years as an advisor, and then 20 years before that as a leader in business. And the lessons that we've learned from that, we kind of pulled together last year in this model. I thought I'd share with you, because I think there's some really good lessons for leaders here when they're thinking about developing a strategic process. I'll start at the second box, which is the development box. That's kind of where we talk about, developing strategy and the arguments about whether that, it should be this annual thing we do for half a day or 2 days. Which I think is the wrong argument. I think the amount of time you need to spend on it needs to be balanced with how much work you need to do on your strategy. But the real key thing is once you start building that new strategy, you can't expect to do it in one sitting. You need to take a break from that work and give yourself some time to percolate on what's been said and agreed, so you can then come back and refine that before you set it to move forward. So that percolation is a real lesson that we've learned over the last 30 years. But what we've added in before that is you'll see the engagement piece. So the engagement is really about making sure that all the stakeholders involved in developing a strategy are engaged before we even start. Otherwise, the process of developing strategy becomes very fractious. So we don't do any strategy work without engaging those stakeholders, whether it's through interviews or whether it's through deeper scope. But we make sure that all those people have been engaged with, have been spoken to, and are in the right place before we move into that development phase. Sorry, not the final piece, the next piece, which I think very, very few organizations do, and I think it's probably ultimately the most important, is once that strategy is set, it's really, really important we align our people. We have something called Basecamp that we do that with, but what that's really all about is then getting at least the next level of management, but sometimes even whole businesses together, where they not only get the opportunity to understand what the strategy is, we obviously want them to buy into that strategy, but obviously then take some ownership in taking that away and then realizing it, which obviously then leads into the need to implement, which is obviously where we do a lot of our work around coaching and our programs. But ultimately, strategy is nothing but that implementation and action. And part of that for us is actually making sure that at least once a year you stop and reset and refine. No strategy is ever perfect, so you do need to stop and ask yourself, what have we learned from the last year, and what do we need to do to refine that moving forward? So I thought I'd share that model with you. In terms of a tool, I thought I'd give you a tool. Now, I'm not going to give you a SWOT analysis, because people that know me well know that I have a real issue with SWOT analysis. It's probably the one thing that gets thrown at me most when I go and sit down with organizations. And for me, they're always a bit of a so what. So we have a list of loads of strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats. If you didn't know what a SWOT was, although I'm sure most of you do. But for me, nothing ever seems to happen with them other than lots of conversation about what they may mean or what we might do, but there's never a strategic conversation. So what I wanted to show you, and I've given you a handout on this as well that you can use after today, which is a SWOT is useful if you make it a strategic SWOT. So how a strategic SWOT works is absolutely list down your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And then the challenge is, though, is only to have 3 of each. So when you've got your list of 10 of each, or 15 of each, or 20 of each, then challenge yourself to say, actually, if we just took 3 of these forward as either the biggest strengths or the biggest threats, etc., what 3 are we going to take forward? And if you have a challenge, concede to 4, but definitely no more than 4. And then to make this strategic, what you need to be asking yourself is, if we're going to look at strengths and opportunities, how do we commercialize those? Because that's obviously what we want to do. How do we stop those opportunities and weaknesses? How do we make sure our weaknesses don't spoil our opportunities? How do our strengths and threats, how do we use our strengths to overcome our threats? And then what corrective action do we need to take to stop these weaknesses and threats coming together? And what I've just given you here to use, oh, my screen's gone blank again. It's not good. Bear with me. Come back to that. What I've given you here is 4 questions that you can use if you want to facilitate this with your teams, which is actually to put the question up, how can I use these 3 strengths to commercialize these opportunities? What do we do to make sure these weaknesses don't spoil these opportunities? What if these weaknesses combine with these threats? What corrective action will I take? And then how do I use these strengths to overcome these threats? If you can drive a conversation around those 4 questions, you'll then have a SWOT that actually is useful and meaningful in terms of strategy. Okay, so just moving that on and keeping it moving in terms of lead and change. So this is a huge subject, and I think probably one that many leaders struggle with. And I kind of put this picture up because I think most people resonate with this. I think if you actually ask our people who wants to change, most people answer yes, we absolutely want change. In fact, they'll probably tell you they want things to change without even you asking them. But the minute we ask them to change personally, kind of the tumbleweed starts to come across the floor. And of course, if we ever asked our people to lead the change, I think you'd probably find an empty room, which is a challenge for us. But what I wanted to do with this is just blow away a myth. The myth that people don't want change, or people are resistant to change, is actually a complete myth. What we need to understand is the challenge is what motivates people to change, and the speed at which they will be comfortable with change is very different, and it's very different between leaders and people. So typically leaders live in a world where they're looking for change, they want change, they understand why change is important, and they're prepared to move very quickly to achieve it. Most people do want the change, as that first box says, but what they're looking for based on the motivation is they're basically saying, I want to change, but I just want to feel safe and secure before I go there. So they just don't move as quickly as leaders. So there's just a bit of a myth bust there for you to say, don't get into this kind of thinking that people don't want change. What they need is actually need to feel safe and secure enough to actually start to change and start to move with you, but it might not be as quick as you would move as a leader. So, and I can expand on that offline if people want me to do so. But what I wanted to share with you today is that we have a massive problem around change. So this stat, 70% of business initiatives, large and small, typically fail year on year, 30% succeed. There's numerous reports every year that come out from, whether it's from Harvard or McKinsey or many other organizations, the results are always the same. And I can't remember a year, probably in the last 30 years, where that wasn't the case. I'm going to share with you a model, though, where not only did we actually prove that was the case, but what we also proved was that most of those successes were also failures. So typically how change has worked is we try and change something, do it differently. Nearly 100% of the time it doesn't quite work, but if we're persistent, we'll try again and we'll refine it, and if we're persistent enough and we put enough energy and effort into it, then we'll get it over the line. So those 30% of successes are typically made out of failures that we persistently kind of keep pushing with and keep adapting until we get there. That's why there's so much, I think, emotional cost around change, why people are exhausted by change, because the way we get there is so difficult. And it isn't surprising. I'm going to keep, my screen is definitely dropping out today. It isn't surprising when you understand the fact that there's been no statistically proven change success model ever until the model I'm going to share with you in a second. And that model was developed by a man called Dr. Chris Mason. Chris, back in 2008, was looking at a study. A few things came together for Chris, and probably not in a good way. There was a study globally done that looked at how recent was the most original piece of management theory. It turned out it was a piece of change theory, but it was over 50 years old. So if you thought consultants regurgitated the same stuff over again in a different way, you were absolutely right. But Chris, I think more importantly, had a client and a friend who ultimately ended up killing himself because he couldn't turn his business around. So Chris was in a place where he had a friend who was dead because he couldn't resolve his issues with his business. And we as consultants were using the same old models and getting the same old terrible results. And Chris felt compelled to do something. So he spent 4 years getting a PhD in psychological change, and developing a model that became the first piece of original management theory in over 50 years. But Chris being Chris, what he did, he then turned it into a model that we could actually use in business. And we've now had probably 7 years of this model being deployed in the market. And we now know statistically it has an over 80% success rate if followed correctly and with no failure if it's done properly. And that's what I want to share with you today. Before I do that, just one thing on leadership on change. We absolutely know through the work that Chris did that there is a big indicator on change success depending on whether the leadership of your business is either transformational or transactional. And what I mean by that is transformational leaders tend to be the leaders that are very visionary, kind of what's next, what's possible, you know, where can we push on to in our next phase. Whereas transactional leaders are very much what I call the leadership of the management. So making sure that we do the things we do today properly. Now, it's really important to say neither one is more important than the other. In great businesses, there is both, and probably in fairly equal measure. But when you require change, if transactional leadership dominates, usually change stalls. So you need to be thinking about your own leadership style. Am I transformational? Am I transactional? And if you are transactional, where is the transformational leadership in my organization? How can I harness that to make sure it dominates through a period of change? Okay, so I wanted to share this model. So what we've learned from Chris's work is that change is actually driven by three things. I'll start at the bottom with beliefs, because I think that's where most change theory or so-called change theory starts, that we have to basically change the beliefs of people so that we can move their behavior. We do obviously need people to behave differently to change, but what we actually know now statistically is only 30% of change success, and actually 40% comes from the capability of our people and organization, and 30% comes from our readiness to be able to change. And typically no change theory books, etc., ever talk about the capability or the readiness. It's always like this kind of almost acceptance that of course we're capable, we'll be ready when we need to be ready. We just need to make sure everyone believes we can do this. So the minute you start to look at that and you look at that 70-30 split, you see where the problem is. As I said, want to make this practical. I'm going to keep jumping out of my screen because it keeps closing on me, but we'll get there. There's actually 10 levers that sit around those three core things, and I'm just going to quickly explain them to you now. So in terms of being ready, when you think about change, you need to think about it as some sort of change context, so that a project or something you're trying to do. And it's really important that you think about everybody that will be impacted by that change when you start to ask yourself where you are. So don't just think about the leadership or the management team driving it. You've got to think about all the people that will be impacted by the change. And then what those people do in the case of readiness is they will ask themselves, do I think we have the support of our leadership, both emotionally and physically? Because if people don't feel they have both of those things, they will resist change. People will ask themselves, is there a need for this change? If people just don't think it's necessary, then they'll resist change. The next one, WIIFM, is what's in it for me. People will ask themselves, you know, what's in it for me personally? It's actually one of the biggest levers in change. It's probably also worth noting it's one of the most difficult things to manage as a leader, because potentially everybody's what's in it for me can be very, very different. So this notion of sitting 30 people down in a room and saying, this is going to be good for you to do this change with us, is completely flawed, because within a group of 30 people, you may have 10 different reasons personally why it's good for them. So that takes some management. The next one was a kind of a surprising one, although not when you understand strategy and roadmaps. People will actually ask themselves, if we're going to do this change, what process are we going to go through to make it happen? And if people can't see that process, they tend to resist the change. And the last one around readiness is confidence. So confidence comes from what's gone before. So if you have a culture in your business where, you know, we come up with new ideas and we kind of get really excited and move on them, and then we kind of give up and let them go, or we never see them through, the confidence of people will be very low, because they tend to go, oh, here we go again, another crazy idea, just keep your head down, it will go away. So people just don't move on the change. So that's something you'll need to think about and tackle. Into capability, people will ask themselves on this question on an organizational and personal level. So on a personal level, people will say to themselves, if I was to, do I think right here, right now in the job I'm doing, I'm capable? Because if they don't feel capable now, they're not going to think about anything else. But they will also ask themselves, if I do, in doing this new thing you want me to do, do I still think I'll be capable? Because if I don't, I want to resist the change. But they'll also do that of your organization. So they'll say, you know, do we even deliver what we say we're going to deliver now as a company? Because if the answer is no, I'm not even thinking about anything else. But if we do, they'll still go to where you want the organization to be. Go, do I think as an organization we'll be able to deliver on that? Because if I don't, I'll resist the change. And then the last three boxes is kind of around that traditional kind of belief and psychology area. People will look at the perceived difficulty. If they feel it's too difficult, they'll tend to resist it. If their attitude is more positive or negative towards change, obviously more negative, they'll tend to resist it. And the last one, again, probably a surprising one, is people will actually ask themselves, and bear in mind, a lot of these things can be subconscious with people, and this is one definitely. If I was to do this thing differently that you want me to do, would the people that are important to me think well of me? So it could be their families, it could be their friends, it may be their peers. And again, another tough one, because everyone's significant others can be very different, and it also can be quite different from company to company, depending on your culture. So one quick story on that: we worked with a company in Australia 3 or 4 years ago, where a very large company in a construction and engineering space, who had a very, I would say, very family-based culture, and they spent vast amounts of money on staff communications, most of it digital. And what they chose to do off the back of this was stop all digital communication to their staff and start to print everything, but post it to their home addresses, but not addressed to them. So the first people that picked them up were their families and their loved ones, with the view that when they did that, they would look at it and say to their husbands when they came in, and their wives, "God, I saw this thing that happened at work, that looks amazing." And they saw a direct correlation between that change and actually people adopting change in the workplace. So that's just a kind of interesting case study around what's a quite difficult thing to manage in terms of change. So in the handout I've given you on this, you'll notice that they've got some very easy little scores. So the idea is in the context of your change initiative, as I said, being very, very clear about the people involved. Where do you think you are on these 10 factors? The big watch on this was 2 watches on this. If you don't know, you have to score low. So if you don't know if everybody gets the need for change, then score yourself low, and your strategy then is to do something about that. And the other thing is not to be over optimistic. I think most leaders score this diagnostic on the basis of where they are as a leader and where their leadership team is, not on where all the people impacted by the change are. And that's the real key on this one. I just thought as well that I think it's important for a business to have a change success formula, and this is ours. And I'm not saying this is the only one, but it's the one that we have. And we believe that change success comes from having a proven change model, which I've just been through with you, and that is the only proven change model that exists in the world. But obviously, change comes from excellent implementation. And so for us, what we look to do is, and this is probably where you get to the link to the strategy, is, if you have a very clear vision and plan, you have a process that you use for change, you have the right type of leadership, dominated by transformational if you want change, you have a team that works on that, because very rarely do individuals drive change, and you have some form of monitoring and audit as you go through a process. For us, that usually drives change success. So I'd ask yourself, use that change model to diagnose where you are on a project, either before, during and after, but also think about what's your process for implementation that will give you that real change success formula. Okay, I'll just put these up for you. We've got 2 of our diagnostics as well on our SailShift website. So the handout I've given you is in a slightly deeper change success diagnostics. You can go in there and do it probably take you no more than 10 minutes. I'll give you a slightly deeper report than the diagnostic that I've given you there. I will also give you some indicators of kind of where you might need to focus to actually drive and change success based on where you are currently. Also want to mention on there's a personal change diagnostic. Now we discovered more recently that the core 3 drivers for personal change are exactly the same, but the levers around the outside are different. And so we've remodeled the personal change diagnostic to reflect that. Again, there's a free tool on our website that you can jump into if you're trying to go through some personal change, whether it's losing weight, getting fit, whatever it is you're trying to change in yourself. That change diagnostic will give you some really good pointers, and I'm very happy to discuss that with anybody else afterwards if they need to. Okay, as I said, I want to keep it punchy because I always like to keep it open for questions at the end. I don't know if I'll check see if you've been putting questions in as we go or comments, but I'll probably put you on advance warning now, because I think some of the richest parts of these webinars over the last 3 months have been the comments, the challenges, and the questions. So please feel free to throw some in or get ready to put up your hand. It's bound to drop out once more, isn't it? But just before that, the last thing I wanted to share with you in terms of kind of thriving at the other side of this, there's no doubt that this notion of growth mindset, which we've talked about long before COVID, but I think I want to put it in a COVID kind of context now. So for those that aren't aware of the growth mindset work by Carol Dweck, which kind of measured that people with a fixed mindset who believe that their intelligence and that capability is static, they tend to sort of fall into a world they need to look smart, so they'll tend to avoid challenges and avoiding opportunities to grow. Whereas people with that growth mindset to believe that intelligence and performance can be developed, so they're always looking for ways to learn and always embracing challenges that will enable them to do that. But that work, again, for those that aren't familiar with it, was done on children between 11 to 16 originally, and in almost every instance, an 11-year-old with a fixed mindset who was far more intelligent than a child with a growth mindset was overtaken by the time they were 16. But we've now extrapolated this work out through adulthood, and we know that it continues through the whole of our life. So whether you're 11 to 16 or you're 50, 60 or 70, you can work on your growth mindset. I just wanted to share this is kind of an overview from the book. But I think what I wanted to do with this is not just, again, give you this tool, but also get you to think about this in a COVID situation. So there's no doubt that as we come through this, probably all leaders are going to need to refine, improve, or even learn some brand new skills. So having a mindset where your skills are fixed and you can't do anything to get new ones, obviously is going to be unhelpful in this situation. Challenges, clearly, there is no way to avoid the challenges that we're currently facing in the COVID situation. So you can see how in a fixed mindset world, this is just going to be compounded through COVID-19. I don't think anyone's going to get through the depth of recession that we're going to be hit with as we come out of lockdown without an incredible amount of effort. So, again, a world where you think you can just sit back and be clever enough to see this through is probably a delusional one. Again, none of us are experts at everything. So I think being able to get feedback from around us and information from around us is going to be key. So that kind of mindset where I'm going to really get feedback, but also absorb what I can learn from the outside world is going to be critical. And I don't think any of us are going to get all the answers right from the start. So we're all going to have to, we talked about pivot and adapt last time. We're going to try some things, not everything's going to work. So we're going to have to sort of use those as a wake-up call to go again, as a growth mindset person would do. But if we're going to get discouraged quickly, which obviously is a real sign of lack of resilience as well, we're going to really struggle. So I wanted just to sort of give that to you. For those who haven't seen it, I recommend the book by Carol Dweck, Mindset. For those that have seen it before, I want you to really challenge yourself, because we can all drift into the red from time to time about how important this is going to be in a COVID-19 situation. Okay, so punch through that. Three good tools for you there to use, hopefully. The SWOT, but make it strategic, the change diagnostic, and that growth mindset. So let's make sure we get back to strategy. Focus first, on your direction, and don't get sort of lost in sales and operational strategies if you don't actually know where you're going or what your go-to-market strategy is. And if you're going to do a SWOT, make it strategic. You need to proactively manage the change and make sure you apply that transformational leadership, and hopefully that change success model will help you. And say work on that growth mindset, which I think I've laboured now enough. Okay, so any questions I'll move into in a second. One last drop out of my slide, that was inevitable. The 2 free courses are still available. You've literally, really you've got to the end of the day today. So any of you or any of your staff want to jump on those, you've got to the end of the day today. I'll probably leave it open to 9 o'clock Monday morning, but after that I'm going to have the door slammed in my face on that. I've already had a 2-week extension. So if you want those, jump on. Your support coach is here for you through this program. I know I am the support coach for some of you. I'm not, but not for all. But they're there, and I'm here post this webinar if you need anything. And as ever, we'll send these materials out in terms of the recording and the slides and the handouts, so you can reflect on those. And again, any questions, just fire them over to us. Other than that, I will move into questions. And let's see. Got a couple of questions in the Q&A. So feel free to put up your hand as well. It's always good to give people the floor, let them speak. But while you're thinking about that, Ian said, are the resources and presentation content available for download, Jason? Yeah, the answer to that, Ian, is yes. They'll be put up. I'm just trying to be honest about how quickly after this. They're normally up within an hour, but you'll get an email from one of the guys in the office here, which will take you through to our website where the handouts, the slides and the recording will be available. So yeah, they'll be there, Ian. And then I've got a question here from Ralph. Do you suggest putting the strategy plan together with the whole company so there is buy-in, or have the leadership put it together and roll it out to the company? Okay. The latter, although I've probably got a slight slant on that. It's a bit like culture. There's a kind of wave of people think, oh, you can only develop your culture if you start from the bottom and involve all the people, which as someone that actually does cultural transformation, I can tell you is complete nonsense. Because the culture ultimately will have to be a reflection of the people that own the business and run the business, because the culture is going to be driven by their core beliefs and their behaviors, because they're the only things that they'll support. So when we do culture, we always start with the leadership and the ownership, but then it's not so much about rolling it out, it's then about how we then retrospectively engage everybody else in that strategy, so they feel that they are part of it and they can buy into it, and they kind of own it equally. And it's the same with strategy. So we always work on strategy, and I suppose that's why the model is important at a strategic direction level with the leadership, and get that really flushed out. And then we will engage the rest of the business in buying into that, but then also giving them ownership to develop the deeper strategy down the levels. In fact, if I'm really honest, and again, I talk from a position of having done this for 30 years rather than just being a theorist on it, if you go to the business without that high level strategic direction, people look at you in a lost way, because it's almost like you're the leader, give us a clue where we're going so we have something to work with. So that's kind of where I think you need to go with that. But I think if you just try and roll it out, then you'll get rejection. You'll get into that place of change where people are going, oh, what's this you're trying to inflict on me? That feels a bit scary. It's more about how you engage and buy them in. And that's what our base camp's all about, how we get buy-in and pass over ownership for that. So hopefully, Ralph, that answered your question. Okay, I'm just checking. So anybody want to stick their hand up and throw a question out to the room, or a challenge, or a thought? Or if you're not comfortable putting your hand up, feel free to drop it into one of the boxes, and I'll happy to keep talking to myself. It's always strange on a webinar when you can't see or hear anybody. I will wait, because I know some people like a bit of time to think, and I've learned over the last few months that the awkward silence of a minute or two is often followed by a wave of questions. I'd be interested as well, because some senior people in the room where you've actually done some of this stuff in your businesses and where it's either worked well or it's worked less well, because I think people always welcome that being shared from other leaders. So if any of you are prepared to share any of those thoughts or experiences, that would be great. Okay, shy people today. There's questions coming up in the box. Okay, lots of questions in the box. Okay, so I've got Liz asking, what are my thoughts if you want to drive change but realize you don't have yeah, I think Liz, I think you've got a bit of yours missing there because I can't see the rest. So if you can just, I'll just jump to Ralph. If you can just update that or stick your hand up, that'll be really good. That's the start of a great question, but I can't read it all, unfortunately. Ralph, there's a paper. Is there a paper book on Dr. Mason's work for the average CEO? The answer is yes. Yeah. Well, the first answer is no, Ralph, because I suppose the academic work, which has to be there for it to be a bona fide PhD and measured as a proper piece of theory that is recognised, I wouldn't say is for the average CEO. I have to confess I've never read it, although I know a lot of the content of it. However, I've got more than just what I've just shown you today is probably the short answer. So there's not a paper as much, but I've got a little bit more than I've shown you today that I can share with you. If you're more than the average CEO and you can digest huge academic papers, Chris has no issue sharing those out. And in fact, I think it's public anyway because it has to be as a PhD. So yeah, anybody that wants a bit more information, or if you actually want if you feel the need to check out the full psychological analysis and PhD, then all of that is available. Just let me know. Liz, I'd love you to finish. Here we go. I've got Liz's question now. So Liz, what are your thoughts if you want to drive change but realize you don't have the capabilities in the business? Well, the straight answer, Liz, is that you probably won't achieve it. That's what we've learned from doing this work. So the capabilities is interesting because sometimes with capability, the resistance to it is people don't believe that they are capable of what you want them to do. But many people are capable of more than they realize. So I think the first thing is to check, is this a confidence issue with the person? and do they need some support, encouragement, maybe some training, because they are capable given the right conditions and support. But if the answer to that is still no, and you need to make the change, you have to change the people. So it goes back to that old fashioned change the people or change the people. There's no other way, because if the capability isn't there, the change won't happen. And that's, I think, one of the big lessons from this piece of work, and that moves us away from the, I think, previous thinking and change, that we just make the assumption that all of our people will just cope with it and be able to do it, which is a huge mistake. Okay. Happy to take a couple more questions. Again, hands up if you want to put your hand up and speak rather than type, or I don't think I've got any more questions. I'm just checking the different boxes, but no, so I'm out of questions. So again, I'll give it a pause and allow people to digest and come back with some questions. I'll give it one more minute, and then if we're all questioned out, I'll bring it to a close. But as I said, talk to your coach, talk to me after this webinar. I'm more than happy to go deeper on some of these things or talk about it in a more contextual way for you and your business. Okay, just the last few moments before I call it a day. Okay, I think we're questioned out. As I said, thank you again for joining us. Reiterate that we're here. It's not just about these webinars. It is about supporting you on this journey over the next few weeks. We'll be back next week for the third webinar, which is on getting productive. I think we're all going to be under pressure to be a bit leaner coming out of this. So that will be the focus of next week. And then that will then lead into the week after, where we'll have our guest speaker named Alvi from Notepad talking about leveraging your brand. And saw Naim do that session with another group that we're running through this cycle yesterday. It's some great insights there, and a chance not to have to listen to me, which is always good, before we'll wrap up the week after that with how we're going to sustain this growth for the longer term. So thank you again for joining us. I look forward to catching you next week if I don't speak to you before.